Welcome, everyone, to Hot Science at Home. We're so glad you could make it. The Environmental Science Institute at the University of Texas is excited to bring you the latest and coolest advancements in science through Hot Science at Home. Please join me in welcoming Tiana Bruno, our special guest for this evening. Welcome, Dr. Bruno. How are you tonight?
I'm great. Thank you for having me.
We're excited to have you. Let me tell you a little bit about Dr. Bruno. She attended Texas A&M University and then the University of Oregon, where she received her PhD in geography. And that is where she is tuning in from tonight. She was then recruited to join the University of Texas's Provost Early Career Fellows Program. Tiana was born and raised in Houston, and her family is from Port Arthur. She first got interested in environmental justice from seeing examples of it firsthand in Port Arthur, as we'll hear about tonight. She's a leading expert on the relationship between race, spatial patterns, and the environment. So Tiana, let's get into it. What's the definition of environmental justice from your perspective?
Yeah, so there are different ways to understand and define environmental injustice. The definition that I work with is environmental injustice refers to the uneven distributions of environmental benefits and burdens and inequality in the environmental decision-making process based primarily on race, but also class, gender, and other marginalizing factors such as immigration status. And then when we think of environmental burdens, there are a lot of things that can come to mind, but some examples include different types of pollution. So we have air, water, and soil pollution from, say, refineries, waste sites, other locations of chemical processing, as well as intense agricultural sites. But there are other ways that environmental injustice manifests in the landscape besides through pollution. There is inequitable access to parks and green space, inequitable access to affordable and efficient transportation, and inequalities in various types of effective and quality infrastructure, such as water or storm and flood management infrastructure.
Okay, given this definition, then what's been the timeline for environmental justice, or EJ for short, in the United States? What's been the history of it?
Yeah, so the environmental justice movement in the US really takes off in the 1980s. But it's also important to remember that there were cases of communities making noise about their environmental experiences long before this. But this organizing and collectivizing and really recognition starts to take place in the 1980s. But it's important to position this movement and the organizing within this broader picture of what's happening with movements in the US. Let's not forget that the 1960s and 70s were quite a time. I wasn't there, but I've heard. So think of all the movements happening at the time. There are others not even listed here on this slide, of course, but these are some of the key ones around race and environment. And I wanted to include these so we don't forget that the environmental justice movement and this time we're organizing and being heard as it relates to environmental justice does not just happen on its own. It doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Mm-hmm.
So in particular to environmental justice, we have a protest in 1982 in Warren County, North Carolina, where a Black community protests against the dumping of contaminated soils in their community where they live. This protest plays a big role in sparking and setting inertia for the movement in the US. And then in 1987, the study called The Toxic Waste and Race in the United States comes out. And this study found that race was the key variable associated with the location of hazardous waste sites, meaning that communities of color were more likely to be in locations of hazardous waste sites than their counterparts. In 1991, there's the first National People of Color Environmental Leadership Summit, where the environmental justice principles are drawn up. And then it's not until 1994 where we see the first federal directive to incorporate environmental justice into federal agency actions and decisions. So ever since then, it's been great. And we, people of color, have lived with clean air, water and soils, all sorts of environmental equity ever since, right? In fact, the 2007 follow-up to the Toxic Waste and Race study, some 20 years later, found that things are the same, if not worse, for communities of color.
So this history is for the United States. What's the situation in Texas? What are some of the present day most pressing issues?
Yeah, so just to give some examples and sort of set the stage of what this looks like and how this manifests in Texas before diving more deeply into my research site. So here's some examples of environmental justice in Dallas. As a side, I encourage folks to also notice these dates or these stories, to think about that in context to the decades of struggle, litigation, and policymaking that I just mentioned. So in Southeast Texas, in Southeast Dallas, there's an example of one of those sites that would be in this toxic waste and race study. Inside a Black and brown community, on their street actually stood a 100,000 ton heap of waste, referred to as the Shingle Mountain. This pile sat and grew for a few years before finally being moved just last year to an even larger waste site, also aside the community. And then also a little further southeast in the Dallas area, in the town of Sand Branch, which is a historically Black community, this community struggled for some decades with lack of access to running water, largely due to a lack of infrastructure and services, even though the Dallas water treatment plant is actually right next to this community. And so, well, that's some examples from Dallas. If we move further to the south, to South Texas, near the border, there are communities called colonias, which are mostly Latinx communities that have struggled for a long time with water insecurity and inequitable access to clean water for decades, also largely due to a lack of infrastructure. And also, if we think of going toward the Gulf Coast, so think of that lower Gulf Coast area of Texas, there's a large amount of oil and gas processing facilities interweaving Black and brown communities in places like Corpus Christi, as well as the Rio Grande Valley.
So your area of research is actually in Southeast Texas. What are the challenges in this region?
Yes, so Texas, of course, is known for its oil and gas economy, to say the least. I think we all know that. In particular, the Texas upper Gulf Coast has the highest refinery output in the country. Houston is a financial center of this oil complex, but as it shows on this map, it also has several refineries, usually very close to Latinx and Black communities. And then if we move a little bit further southeast, going towards Louisiana, there is Port Arthur, Texas, which is what the U.S. called the center of the largest oil refinery network in the world. So located in this predominantly Black community is the largest oil refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, the Motiva Refinery. This refinery actually shares a fence with several public housing units in the historic west side, which is the historically Black side, as this image shows. So on this historically Black side of town, again, the west side, this is where Black people were segregated to and could not move from until after desegregation. And this massive refinery is just one of several in the city. But in addition to these numerous sources of pollution, the geography of this region really makes it prone to hurricanes and intense storm events, as well as sea level rise.
Tiana, you froze for a couple of moments there.
Oh no, am I back now? Oh no. How about now?
You're good now.
Okay. Let me know again, and I have a backup if my Wi-Fi doesn't break up.
And now you froze. All right, come on back, Tiana. Technical difficulties. So I think what we can do at this point.
Are we good now?
Yeah, you're back now.
Okay.
Yeah,
okay.
Go ahead.
Okay, I switched over to my hotspot just in case it was my Wi-Fi. So I was saying that in addition to the numerous sources of pollution, the geography of this region makes it prone to hurricanes and intense storm events, as well as the impacts of sea level rise happening on the Gulf Coast.
Okay, so I'll tell you what, D-Day has connection to stabilize.
Can you all still hear me? Okay. So I'll just keep going and hope that you all can still hear me. So this image, I think, really highlights how environmental and climate injustice compound in this region. So this is the Motiva Refinery with flooding from the Hurricane Harvey event. As it is apparent in this image, several studies have found that these intense storm events that are actually growing more intense due to climate change tend to dislocate and spread pollution and contamination to nearby communities. So not only are residents experiencing the hurricane and all that it comes with, but also the ways that these storms exacerbate their interactions with pollution.
Okay, so I hear my connectivity, so you just keep going, Tiana.
Gotcha. Okay, no problem there. Okay, so in the next slide, I want to start positioning this all historically. So regarding to the racial and industrial history, after Reconstruction, we start to see an increase in Black populations in this region, drawn for several factors. One important aspect is these various industries, not just oil, but also rice and timber. And then, of course, the oil industry as well. And then as the Black population increases, they are then officially segregated to the west side that I mentioned before, which is, again, the historically Black side of town. This is where, of course, where the refineries and oil activity are, as was shown in that picture earlier. And I want to mention this for two reasons. First, folks like to talk about, well, the land was cheap, so that's why communities of color ended up close to these refineries. But it is clear in the case of Port Arthur that it's actually racist segregation policy that doesn't allow Black people to move to other areas of town, even if they could afford it. So it's really clear that there's an intersection of racial processes with where these facilities end up being. But I also mentioned this to position it within the present day landscape of environmental injustice and show it how it develops historically, especially in the context of when regulatory agencies, in particular the US EPA, start monitoring pollution and contamination in the city. So there are decades, I think on the timeline, we'll see where the EPA starts, which is actually about 1980. So there are decades of environmental injustice history that actually predate agency monitoring.
Okay, so Tiana, as I understand it, you're coming through fine, and it's just my perception of how things are. But let me go ahead and then pick it up from here. Now that you've taken us through this timeline. So the goal of your research is to understand how these impacts have occurred over time. And so how can you reconstruct the changes of these environmental impacts through time?
Yeah, so many studies have shown, can we go to the next slide? No? Great, thank you. So many studies have shown that trees pick up trace elements from their surrounding environment through roots, leaves, and other parts of their system. And those elements collect in their tree rings. So trees provide these natural archives of contamination history. And then the next slide shows that trees produce these rings that allow us to capture what the surrounding environment of that tree looked like during that year. So in addition to these contamination history that's can be developed as we look at how these elements manifest in these different rings, we can then also understand characteristics of climate, our climate due to these characteristics of these rings that provide a lot of information, particularly about flooding. So the width, particularly the width of rings, give us a lot of information about flooding history or the lack of flooding. So we learned a lot about drought as well.
Mm-hmm. And these rings can then let us count backwards through time to when the tree first grew. And what has your research so far discovered in terms of the time span that you'll be able to cover in Port Arthur?
Yeah, so of the trees that I've cored around Port Arthur, the oldest one was about 100 years. And this one came out of West Side Port Arthur, which is, again, as I described, that historically Black side of town, also right next to the largest refinery in the Northern Hemisphere, and a refinery that's been growing for some time. And then the youngest one is at least 30 years. So that actually is probably about when the EPA starts monitoring. So as this timeline shows, chemical analysis of these tree cores can provide information of environmental experiences of communities facing environmental injustice that exceed what's available from environmental agency data. So accessing this history is important not only to understand this long-standing, broader causes of these perpetual issues of environmental injustice, but also to gain insight into the environmental lives of communities that are often left out of these traditional archives. I'm also using oral histories to pair with these trees to get a broader understanding of not only experiences of pollution and hurricanes that exceed what's available in either environmental agency archives or other sort of traditional archives and collections that tucked away in libraries, but also bringing in these oral histories to get a sense of what Black ecological life looked like. So gardening, different ways of meeting subsistence, and just practices of fun and living, and that's often not usually understood as a part of an environmental justice living experience, to sort of flesh out what life, particularly Black life, is like, even in environmentally precarious spaces.
Wow, fascinating. So all kinds of testimony being provided verbally through oral histories, and then there are the silent trees, seemingly silently witnessing all of this over the years, but maybe not so silently actually recording it for you later to come in and uncover it. That's a fascinating approach to reconstructing this. Thank you for sharing that with us. And apologies for the technical glitches on my end. This is the first Hot Science at Home I've done from a hotel instead of from my trusted office. I called the hotel to ensure that they had a good wireless connectivity. They assured me they did. I read 280 reviews, did not find any complaints about the wireless. I will not reveal the name of the place I am staying at tonight, but I'm so glad I'm talking to you guys about this now. Yes, so I would encourage our audience to go ahead and submit questions. And we have a question coming in from NMB 2623. Was there a way for cities such as Port Arthur to early on protest the construction of the oil establishments through city councils or city governments?
Thank you so much for that question. So Port Arthur really sort of develops with the progress of oil in Texas. So oil was discovered in 1901 in Texas in Spindletop. Spindletop is essentially Port Arthur. That is where Texas oil history kind of takes off, is this place. So there's not really there's not much protest when oil is first discovered in this area. They were just like, how do we get it all? How do we get it all out of the ground? How do we refine it? How do we build pipelines to get it to different places to get things to the refineries? So when Port Arthur is developing as a city, and not to mention it's a major railroad, it's on a major railroad. It's actually founded by, I think it's Kansas Southern Railroads is the person who founded, that's the Arthur Stillwell of Port Arthur. So it's actually, the development of the city itself is very much entrenched in the development of oil and oil expansion. So as the city itself doesn't protest its sort of inception. But of course, there's definitely been community activists and people from just across the region. As I mentioned, the EPA called it the largest oil refinery network in the world. There's people across the region that are taking pictures, that are collecting data, different ways to monitor, to get more sort of present day information about what the community is experiencing. People definitely going to the EPA, asking for more regulation, better monitoring, asking for different technologies to be in these facilities. There's a lot of organizing for sure that happens in Port Arthur. So I don't want to make it seem like people are just willfully experiencing. There's definitely, just like we talked about in the beginning with Warren County and folks, not accepting these circumstances. That's certainly also the case in Port Arthur and across the region, really.
Yeah. We have a question that's come from Hazel. What is the data like in relation to the health impact?
Thank you. Thank you for that question, Hazel. So what's the data like in relation to the health impact on local communities? Yeah, so I guess I didn't spend a lot of time talking about the health impacts. So there's certainly a high amount of respiratory issues, particularly children asthma, which is sort of a common manifestation across a lot of environmental justice communities. So yeah, a lot of respiratory issues, a lot of cancer. In particular, I think in the Steve Lerner's book, Sacrifice Zones, has a chapter on Port Arthur, and they talk about the cancer rate in Port Arthur being 8% higher than the rest of the state at the time that book came out. And then I think ProPublica has very good maps on cancer risk in Port Arthur and different other communities around that region. So yeah, there's a significant amount of health impacts in the community, and that's sort of a common experience across a lot of environmental justice communities. It's definitely something that people organize around. Seeing children being sick because of where they live is certainly something to organize around. So, yeah.
Right on. Thanks. Tieta, and pick the questions you'd like here and go ahead and answer them.
Okay. I don't see any questions yet.
Comments column.
Oh, yes. Thank you. Okay. So, so much here that I didn't know was here. I'll just go to the next one from Leah. So how does U.S. environmental justice differ from international environmental cases such as Trafigura, dumping of these things are moving on my screen, dumping on the Ivory Coast from Trevor? I don't know much about that particular case. Actually, have not heard of that particular case. But I think so. Part of my next project right now, I'm really diving into Port Arthur to one, develop this sort of method of using trees to access environmental histories of Black communities and really just environmental justice communities. So developing that, as well as developing this oral histories where I talk to people about their family albums to get an understanding of what sense of place and relationship to environment was. So there's a lot to develop in this one project related to Port Arthur and Southeast Texas. So I've not yet moved from this region to incorporate other communities around the globe, but that is the next step. I am hoping to look at relationships where there's a multinational corporation that's working in, say, Port Arthur or say somewhere in Louisiana, and also working in Nigeria. And it's the same sort of manifestation that we're seeing, but of course, deeply different racial histories, deeply different political histories and political contexts, but somehow very similar experiences. And also understand how their forms of struggle and resistance are related. And also other forms of ecological relationships that are sort of across the Black diaspora, and think about that also within this context. So I don't have an answer to that yet, besides to understand that there are a lot of ways that marginalization, particularly around Blackness and different sorts of non-white communities, are easily targeted positioned within experiences of environmental injustice as well as climate injustice. And I think they're also connected in a lot of ways. And that's what I hope to think more about, how are they connected. Great, okay. Can you speak a little bit about the connections between gentrification and environmental justice? Thank you for that question. There's a lot of research on this. So one aspect, or the main takeaway from this sort of area of study and area of a lot of publications, is that if we start to make a place cleaner, better, and then it gets taken away through processes of things get more expensive. It's a more ideal place to live, and so they're priced out of the places they've lived for a long time. That is a concern in Port Arthur. Some of the folks that I have conducted interviews and oral histories with are like, if we make this more like Galveston, then this will no longer be ours. This will no longer be our place to go fishing, and our place to like sort of continue these practices has been passed down to us because we'll be priced out. We fight really hard to make it better, and then we get pushed out. So that is a concern for Port Arthur. I think that also is going to sort of kind of have to confront that the sea's coming, sea's rising, hurricanes are coming, and they're getting harsher, which is something that the entire Gulf Coast and even all the coasts really will have to start thinking about. So that's how those two things intersect. And there's been evidence of that in cities around the US on the West Coast, on the East Coast, New York area, where things get better, and then it becomes more of these environmental amenities, which sort of contrast with those environmental burdens, become more prevalent, and then the sort of standard gentrification story sort of begins to happen. So thank you for the question. Okay. Is there any ongoing previous litigation against refinery companies in Port Arthur, federal investigations? So the refineries in Port Arthur have been around for a long time. There have been many iterations of violations from the various refineries. Valero, Total, Motiva, which is actually, Motiva is actually owned by Saudi Aramco, which is Saudi Arabia, which is their national oil industry there. So there have been, there's two, I'm going to answer this question in two parts. Litigation. So there have been cases where, and are still actually cases where some legal aid groups like Lone Star Legal Aid and et cetera are working with community groups to litigate for various things. Litigate about emissions, litigate about being appropriately compensated if you're being bought out or you're being appropriately compensated. There's a lot of litigation that is happening and has happened for a long time. And then so the other half is federal investigations or federal action. And so violation, like I said, violations actually happen all the time. All the time. It's almost, I'll just say that it happened all the time. And then there are ways that companies can respond to these, whatever sort of citation they get. They pay a fine, or that fine can also be sort of reduced if they take some sort of action for the community. So in the case of Valero, their supplemental environmental project was a community health center that is now on the west side, which not only is sort of a food desert, but also didn't have very much healthcare access in the community at all. So now there is a Westside Healthcare Center that's next to the Development Center, or I can't remember what the next one's called. But yeah, that was a part of a Valero. Valero got fined, and then to sort of offset and supplement whatever they had to pay for the fine, they built that there. So there are many ways that the EPA, usually EPA, can take action against whatever entity, and it's usually fines, and then the different ways you can handle a fine. So thank you for that question, Meg. Are there any other questions? Should I dive for more?
Yeah, go ahead. They're on the bottom of our screen here.
Okay. See some howdies. Howdy. So how do tree, from Jacob, thank you. How do tree ring cores compare to other archives of contamination histories like peat cores, sediment cores, or lichen? Are tree ring cores more valuable in these instances? Thank you. Thank you for that question, Jacob. So there are a variety of ways to reconstruct environments, right? There's tree cores, there's caves and speleothems and such that Jay works a lot more with. And there's soil lake cores. There are a lot of different environmental records to work with to sort of get access to this record of contamination. But I choose trees. So I chose trees, one, because they're easy to date, very easy to date. You get those annual markers and you just go from the middle out, and that every ring is a year. And it's just it's much easier to date than other archives that have different factors they can make different layers move around and such. And then as far back as trees go, when it comes to like lichen, and there are some really, really, really cool, interesting studies where people are using like spider webs and lichen and such to sort of do some environmental monitoring. But that's usually a much more recent understanding of contamination. It's usually much more of that sort of right now, what's happening, what's in my air right now in recent history versus going back maybe to hundreds of years that different species of trees. And then as far back as you go, depends largely on the species of tree that'll have like more rings as it gets older. The bigger the tree does not necessarily mean the older the tree. So different species can be much smaller but have a ton more rings in there. So the reason I chose trees is because they have these different ways of taking contaminants in, from atmospheric deposition as well as absorption, coming from the ground, and then that easy way to date them, being someone that's coming from, largely coming from sort of a human geography approach, thinking more. My first research was on environmental justice policy, and then I started getting more into this sort of environmental science approach. I was really interested in this sort of easy way to date the records. Okay, I'm going to jump to this. Do we have time for one more question?
Oh, keep going. Yeah.
Okay. I'll just keep going.
You do great. We got time. There's lots of really intriguing questions here. You pick.
Okay, I'll just jump to the bottom here from Sophia Bautista. Of the family albums and trees that you observed, has there been a particular observation that stood out to you the most, that has been memorable or impactful in your study's development? Yeah, what has stood out to me? So I think this came up at the very beginning, that my family is actually from Port Arthur. My mom currently lives there, and my grandparents live there, and some of their parents live there. So I have a long history with Port Arthur myself. And so some of what comes up in the family albums is like new to literature, or maybe new to the academic study of environmental justice, but not necessarily new to my life. So when I see that there's rich ecological relationships like fishing and gardening and passing down different practices for, so I would say the one thing that I didn't know was that there are healing practices. So there's like people grow like herbs, or know that particular herbs that grow around, or they grow them in their garden and they share them with each other for healing and different sort of like immune system support, that came up because of COVID. Or it was a practice that happened and it's been happening, but it came up to me and it came up to some of my participants because of COVID, and people really worried and thinking about what are ways that we can really support our immune system, other than what's available, because COVID still is a scary time. So that was something that was really surprising. I didn't really know that we had that practice, but that these practices existed, and that there's this rich amount of environmental and ecological relationships that are sort of never thought of as a part of being in an environmental justice community, wasn't really surprising. It was sort of like validating, and sort of this intersection of my lived experience with my sort of academic experience and academic learning. Yeah, so thank you for that question, Sophia. Okay. I'm gonna jump to the bottom again. So has the Ukrainian invasion and or increasing gasoline prices, aren't we all worried about that, impacted the environmental justice conversation around refining in Port Arthur? So yes, I will say I'm not an expert on sort of oil economy and sort of pricing of oil and how that's shifting markets and impacting different markets, or where any particular percentage of Russian oil, which is what we're talking about here, Russian oil comes from, and how that shapes the markets and stuff. That's not my area of expertise. I will say there has been discussion of Port Arthur sort of increasing its outputs and expansion of refineries and all of that. But I would also add that that's been on the table. Those articles about these refineries considering expansion were out before this started happening with the Ukrainian invasion. So it may be perhaps a convenience, or just helps it make more sense. But I would say expansion of oil processing and these refining and even sort of spinning into other forms of renewable energies as well. All of that in Port Arthur was already sort of on the table, and there's plenty of that discussion happening, and now it just sort of maybe fits more. And then I don't know much about the oil market, so I'm just not I'm not going to say anything about the prices. And yeah, I won't say anything about that. Okay, I think I have time for.
You do.
At least one more. Okay. Do you have experience working with local and state governments to impact change related to environmental justice? If so, can you speak about that? Thank you so much for that question, Sarah. So I wouldn't say that I've worked with. I've talked to and I've interviewed and sort of they've been participants. Folks in local, particularly local government in Port Arthur, have been participants in at least two of my projects in Port Arthur. One on actual environmental justice policy, and this more recent one on the historical context. And yeah, affecting change. I'm more. At one point, there were no signs where I knew there was contaminated water, and I asked about it, and then signs showed up. But that's like the only time I would say something changed. But other than that, there are a lot of people on the ground, and I'm just sort of one person within this mix. So people on the ground who live there, who are doing a lot of organizing there for decades at least, have been asking for change for much more involved ways than I have. And I don't even know if that has created a lot of significant change in the air and water and ground that people live on in these communities. So I think a part of my positioning that the history of environmental justice with sort of the context that I'm talking about now, and even the way we started this discussion with talking about the history of the environmental justice movement, is to highlight that this has been happening for a long time, and there's aspects that are extremely long-standing, much more broad than any particular policy or any particular refinery, even maybe, that I think is important to consider, and to consider why it's perpetually been an issue, even though 1980s is when we supposedly started getting serious about taking change and improving the experiences of folks in these communities. Yeah. So
If you have one more quick one you want to answer, Tiana, we have time for one more.
Okay. What other methods have you tried before landing on examining trees and the impact of fracking refineries in the area? Other methods. So, yeah. So I think you're asking about methods of like monitoring. I have been focused particularly on the history, so I've really focused on trees, and yeah, I've really focused on trees as far as monitoring. I mean, as far as creating a history goes, I am next thinking about including, depending on how this study goes, also including lake cores, because there's a lot of, I don't know if we're familiar with Southeast Texas, it's a very wet area, lots of bodies of water. Sabine Lake is there. Sabine Lake is a bit problematic because it's a part of the port. There's a lot of ships and activity going on, so it may not be as stable as one would hope the lake is. Yeah, so next I'm hoping to look at lake cores, but as far as before this, I've mostly depended on that's what brought me here. I mostly depended on EPA findings or community forms of air monitoring.
Great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tiana. Is it safe to say that there are problems that can be addressed locally, federally, and internationally? And if people are interested in taking part, they can probably find something that they can do and get engaged with at any level. So thank you so much, Tiana, for sharing your insight with us. And for those of you who are interested in learning more, feel free to contact Dr. Bruno. Her email address is right there. And you can also look at our talk archives for looking at past science talks and also a number of talks about environmental justice. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us tonight. And thanks for bearing with us through our technical challenges. Hope to see you next time, and have a great and cool weekend.
Thank
Thank
you
again, Tiana.